He texted me divorce papers while I was burying my father. 2 months later, I bought his failing company as the anonymous investor he'd been desperately courting. 3 years ago, I was the wife he controlled with financial abuse. Now I'm the CEO whose signature he needs to save his career. And it all started with 7 words delivered coldly to my phone at my darkest moment. I want a divorce. Papers attached. Curtis. The funeral home was quiet except for the soft instrumental music playing through hidden speakers. The scent of lilies, my father's favorite, filled the air, their sweetness almost overwhelming in the hushed space. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I stood in my simple black dress, receiving condolences from family and friends who had come to pay their respects to Judge William Foster, a man who had spent 30 years serving his community from the bench. My father had been my rock, my moral compass, the voice of wisdom I turned to whenever life became too complicated. His sudden heart attack had left a void I wasn't sure could ever be filled. And now, as I stood beside his casket, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket, once, twice, 3 times. I ignored it. Whatever it was could wait. This moment was for my father. Aunt Vivian squeezed my hand. He was so proud of you, Ayame, the way you supported Curtis through building his business, putting your own dreams on hold. William always said you had your grandmother's strength. I nodded, unable to speak through the tightness in my throat. What Aunt Vivian didn't know, what no one knew, was how that support had slowly transformed into something more sinister. How Curtis had gradually taken control of our finances, questioned every purchase I made, required justification for every dollar spent. How my law degree gathered dust while I managed his schedule, entertained his clients, and maintained the perfect home. My phone vibrated again, more insistently this time. A call, not a text. "Excuse me?" I whispered to Aunt Vivian. "I need to check this." In the hallway, I pulled out my phone. 4 text messages and a missed call, all from Curtis. My stomach tightened. He knew where I was, what today meant. For him to contact me repeatedly now meant something was very wrong. I opened the texts. "Ayame, we need to talk. This isn't working anymore. I've had my lawyer draw up the papers. It's better this way. I want a divorce. Papers attached. Curtis." The world around me blurred. My fingers felt numb as I opened the attachment. A complete divorce petition, already signed by my husband of 8 years. On the day I was burying my father. I leaned against the wall, struggling to breathe. The funeral director passed by, concern crossing his face. "Mrs. Henderson, are you all right?" I straightened, years of maintaining composure in difficult situations, taking over. "Yes, thank you. Just needed a moment." My phone rang again. Curtis. I declined the call and returned to the funeral service, a strange calm settling over me. My father's voice seemed to whisper in my mind. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Curtis had shown me exactly who he was, and on this day of all days. The service continued. I delivered the eulogy I had carefully prepared, my voice steady despite the earthquake that had just shattered my world. Friends commented later on my strength, my dignity in the face of grief. They had no idea that I was mourning not only my father, but also the death of my marriage, a marriage that I now realized had been built on sand. When I returned to the house that evening, my father's house, where I'd been staying to organize his affairs, I sat in his study surrounded by his law books and allowed myself to feel everything I'd held back during the service. Grief for my father, rage at Curtis's callousness, and beneath it all, a strange sense of liberation. I picked up my father's favorite fountain pen, the one he had used to sign his most important opinions, and began to write. Not a response to Curtis, but something else entirely. A plan. For years, I had managed Curtis's schedule, attended his business dinners, listened to his strategies and concerns. I knew his business partners, his investors, his competitors. I knew which projects were succeeding and which were failing. I knew his passwords, his banking information, his vulnerabilities. Curtis had always treated my law degree as a charming accomplishment, something to mention at dinner parties but never to be taken seriously. He never seemed to realize that I had graduated top of my class, that I had once been courted by the most prestigious firms in the city before setting aside my career to support his. The irony wasn't lost on me. In his effort to control me financially, Curtis had given me a front-row seat to every aspect of his business life, and in his moment of discarding me, he had freed me to use that knowledge. My father had left me a modest inheritance, enough to live on comfortably while I rebuilt my life, but not the kind of wealth that would turn heads. What Curtis didn't know was that my father had also left me his most valuable possession. His network judge William Foster had spent 3 decades on the bench. He knew everyone who mattered in the city, including Ansel Whitman, the managing partner at Whitman Venture Capital. As I sat in my father's study, the outline of a strategy began to form. Not a strategy of revenge, that would be too small, too emotional, too easily dismissed. No, this would be something more elegant, a complete professional transformation that would ripple through Curtis's world like a stone dropped in still water. I reached for my phone and called Ansel Whitman's private number. "Ayame," he answered immediately. "I was so sorry to miss the service. I'm in Singapore, but I'll be back next week. William was one of the finest men I've ever known." "Thank you, Ansel. I actually have something I'd like to discuss with you. When you return, a business proposition." There was a strange peace in my father's house that night after the funeral. As the last of the visitors left, taking with them their casseroles and condolences, I found myself alone with my thoughts and my father's legacy. I hadn't replied to Curtis's texts. Silence was its own form of power, something I had learned from watching my father in the courtroom. "Let them fill the silence," he'd often say. "People reveal themselves when they're uncomfortable." My phone had buzzed throughout the evening with increasingly urgent messages from Curtis. "Did you get the papers? Need your signature ASAP. This doesn't have to be messy. My lawyer says we can be done in 30 days if you cooperate. Ayame, at least acknowledge receipt. I have a major investor meeting next week and need this settled." Each message revealed more about his priorities, his anxieties, and his timeline. Each message was evidence I methodically saved. I spent that night in my father's study, surrounded by his legal volumes and the subtle scent of his pipe tobacco that still clung to the leather chair. The divorce papers lay open on the desk, Curtis's signature bold and confident at the bottom of each page. What struck me most wasn't the dissolution of our marriage, that had been happening in slow motion for years. It was the financial settlement. He proposed a lump sum that represented less than 10% of his company's value, despite my years managing his household, his schedule, his social obligations. Despite the fact that Henderson Tech Solutions had been built while I put my own career on hold. The proposal reflected exactly how Curtis valued my contribution: minimal, disposable, easily quantified, and dismissed. My father's voice seemed to whisper from the leather-bound book surrounding me. "The law isn't just about what's written. It's about what's right." I opened my laptop and began my research. Not emotional, reactive research, but methodical, strategic investigation. I accessed our shared cloud storage using the password Curtis thought I didn't know. I downloaded financial, projections, investor presentations, board meeting minutes, documents I had been vaguely aware of but had never examined closely. As the night deepened, patterns emerged. Henderson Tech Solutions was growing rapidly but stretched thin. The company had leveraged significant debt for expansion. Cash flow was problematic. And most importantly, Curtis was courting a major investor, the Regent Group, whose capital would either secure the company's future or, if withdrawn, potentially trigger a cascade of financial consequences. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A text from Curtis at 2 a.m. only confirmed my analysis. It's better for both of us to handle this quickly and quietly. Regents. Due diligence team arrives next week. Messy personal issues could complicate things. I smiled for the first time that day. Curtis wasn't just being callous, he was being strategic. He wanted the divorce finalized before the Regent Group could discover it, before anyone could question the company's stability during this transition. He had timed the divorce papers to arrive when I would be at my most vulnerable, most likely to sign without question. A classic Curtis tactic, applying pressure at moments of weakness. But he had miscalculated badly. Morning light was filtering through the study blinds when I finally closed my laptop. I had slept perhaps 2 hours, but my mind was clearer than it had been in years. I showered, dressed in one of my father's favorite outfits of mine, a crisp navy suit that he had said made me look like a force to be reckoned with, and prepared for my meeting with Ansel Whitman. Whitman Venture Capital occupied the top 3 floors of a downtown high-rise. The reception area featured stunning African art, Ansel's passion, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city. I was shown immediately to his office. Ayame. Ansel rose from behind his desk, coming around to embrace me. He had known me since childhood, had been one of my father's closest friends. I'm so sorry about William. The world is diminished without him. Thank you for seeing me on such short notice, I said, taking the offered seat. William Foster's daughter never needs an appointment. His eyes, shrewd behind stylish glasses, studied me. But I sense this isn't a social call. It isn't. I placed my folder on his desk. I need your help with a business matter, one that requires both discretion and decisive action. Ansel smiled slightly. Now you sound exactly like your father. He sat back. Tell me. I laid out what I had learned about Henderson Tech Solutions, its potential, its vulnerabilities, Curtis's desperate need for Regent's investment. I explained my situation with clinical detachment, as if discussing a case study rather than my own marriage. Ansel listened without interruption, his expression giving nothing away. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. What exactly are you proposing? He finally asked. I want Whitman Venture Capital to create a shell company that will approach Henderson Tech as a potential investor after Regent withdraws their offer. And why would Regent withdraw? I smiled. Because Tom Regent and my father played golf every Sunday for 20 years. Tom is attending my father's memorial reception tomorrow. Ansel leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. You're suggesting we position ourselves as the only option after Regent pulls out, leaving Curtis desperate enough to accept terms he would normally reject. Precisely. Terms that would include a restructured board with me as chairperson. Curtis remains CEO but with significant oversight, and a comprehensive audit of all company finances before finalizing the investment. Ansel's eyebrows rose slightly. You want to take control of your husband's company. I want to take control of our company, I corrected. The one built on my sacrificed career, my connections, my labor. And the divorce? We'll proceed, but on very different terms than Curtis is expecting. Ansel studied me for another long moment. Then he chuckled softly. William always said you were the most strategic thinker he'd ever taught, even more than your law school professors. He reached for his phone. Let me call in Bobby Chen and Tom Peters. We'll need legal and financial frameworks to make this work. As Ansel made the calls, I felt a sense of calm purpose settling over me. This wasn't about revenge. Revenge would be emotional, reactive, ultimately hollow. This was about justice, about recognition of value, about correct attribution of contribution. My father had spent his life ensuring that justice was served in his courtroom. I would ensure it was served in my marriage and my professional life. Bobby Chen, Whitman's chief legal counsel, arrived first, a compact man with an encyclopedic knowledge of corporate law. Tom Peters, the financial strategist, followed shortly after. Within an hour, the outline of a plan was taking shape on Ansel's whiteboard. "We'll call it Onyx Innovations," Ansel said, writing the name at the top of the board. "Shell Company, privately held, with Ayami as the principal but unnamed investor." Bobby nodded, making notes. "Curtis won't be able to find the ownership structure without significant investigation. By then, it will be too late." "The timing is crucial," Tom added. "Regent needs to withdraw at precisely the right moment, when Curtis has no time to find alternative investors." I listened to these experts build on my initial concept, refining it into something elegant and irrefutable. For years, Curtis had treated me as decorative rather than strategic. He was about to discover how costly that misconception would be. My phone buzzed with another text from Curtis. "My lawyer needs an answer by tomorrow. Don't make this difficult, Ayami." I smiled as I placed the phone face down on the table. Curtis had no idea what difficult truly meant. But he would learn. My father's memorial reception was held at our family home, the elegant Victorian where I'd grown up watching him dispense wisdom to everyone from Supreme Court justices to the neighborhood children. The house was filled with judges, attorneys, and community leaders whose lives had been touched by William Foster's integrity and compassion. I moved through the rooms in a simple black dress, accepting condolences with quiet grace. To anyone watching, I was the grieving daughter, holding herself together through sheer will. Only I knew that beneath my composed exterior, strategic calculations were constantly running. Curtis was noticeably absent. He had sent an elaborate flower arrangement with a card expressing his deepest sympathies during this difficult time, as if he were a distant acquaintance rather than my husband of 8 years. The arrangement sat in the foyer, a silent testament to his priorities. He was too busy preparing for the Regent meeting to attend his father-in-law's memorial. His absence was, in its way, a gift. It allowed me to speak freely with Tom Regent when he arrived midway through the afternoon. Tom was in his 60s, with silver hair and the weathered face of a man who spent his weekends on the golf course regardless of weather. He embraced me, warmly. "Ayame, my dear. William was one of the finest men I've ever known. This world is poorer without him." "Thank you for coming, Tom," I said, leading him to a quiet corner of the study. "Father always looked forward to your Sunday games." Tom's eyes crinkled with fond remembrance. "He beat me more often than not. Said a judge had to have a better poker face than a businessman." He studied me for a moment. "You have his eyes. Same way of seeing right through pretense." I smiled slightly. "Perhaps that's why I've been thinking about something Father once told me about you. He said Tom Regent never makes an investment without understanding the personal character of those he's investing in." Tom's expression shifted subtly, becoming more attentive. "William understood business better than most judges. Character is the one variable that can't be quantified on a balance sheet. That's why I wanted to speak with you privately," I said. "About Henderson Tech Solutions." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Curtis's company? I have a preliminary meeting with them next week." "I know." I kept my voice steady, factual. "And before you proceed, there are elements of the company's situation and its leadership that you should be aware of." I handed him a folder, not filled with emotional accusations or personal grievances, but with carefully selected documents, financial projections that didn't align with the company's actual performance, evidence of cash flow issues carefully obscured in investor presentations, and a copy of the divorce papers Curtis had sent during my father's funeral. Curtis is presenting Henderson Tech as a stable, growing company with strong leadership, I said as Tom reviewed the documents. The reality is more complicated. Tom's expression darkened as he came to the divorce papers. He sent these during William's funeral? His tone held genuine outrage. The timing was deliberate, I replied. Curtis wants the divorce finalized before your due diligence team can discover it. Before questions about the company's stability during a leadership transition can be raised. Tom closed the folder, his expression grim. William mentioned you had put your legal career on hold to support Curtis's business. I did more than put it on hold. I actively contributed to building Henderson Tech through my connections, my unpaid labor, and my support. Yet Curtis values that contribution at less than 10% of the company's worth. Tom was silent for a moment, his fingers tapping thoughtfully on the folder. Then he looked up at me with new respect. What exactly are you asking of me, Ayame? I'm not asking you to make or break a company based on personal matters, I said, carefully. I'm simply providing information that may be relevant to your investment decision. Tom smiled slightly. Just like your father, never telling people what to do, just making sure they have all the facts. He tucked the folder under his arm. Consider your information received. I'll have my team take a closer look at Henderson Tech's financials before we proceed further. As Tom rejoined the reception, I felt a calm certainty. The Regent investment, Curtis's financial salvation, was now in serious jeopardy. The next morning, I visited the offices of Davidson, Chen and Associates. Bobby Chen, who had been part of our planning meeting at Whitman Venture Capital, was waiting for me. Everything is prepared, he said, leading me into a conference room where documents were laid out on the polished table. The counter-petition, the financial disclosure requirements, and the temporary injunction. I reviewed each document carefully, my legal training allowing me to understand every clause, every strategic implication. This wasn't just a divorce response, it was a precisely calibrated legal counter-move. The counter-petition rejected Curtis's proposed settlement and demanded full financial disclosure of all personal and business assets. The temporary injunction would prevent Curtis from making any significant business decisions, including accepting new investors, without court approval, until the financial disclosure was complete. If granted, the injunction would effectively freeze Curtis's ability to close any deal with a new investor, including our shell company, Onyx Innovations. But we had planned for that. The timing would be crucial. This is aggressive, Bobby noted, as I signed the documents. Curtis will fight it. Let him, I replied. Every hour he spends fighting this is an hour he's not securing new investment, and time is not on his side. The judge assigned to your case is Honorable Marcus Johnson, Bobby said. He served with your father on the bench for 15 years. Nodded, recognizing the name. He'll evaluate the injunction request fairly, that's all we need. As I left Bobby's office, my phone buzzed with a text from Curtis, the first in 24 hours. My lawyer hasn't heard from you. Deadline is today? Don't turn this into a battle you can't win, Ayame, I smiled slightly. Curtis had always underestimated me, treating my legal knowledge as theoretical rather than practical, my strategic thinking as non-existent rather than carefully concealed. That underestimation was about to become his greatest vulnerability. By afternoon, Curtis would be served with my counter-petition and the temporary injunction at his office, publicly, visibly. His carefully maintained image of a successful CEO confidently expanding his business would be disrupted by the reality of a messy divorce and potential financial investigation. I sent a brief text to Ansel. Counter-petition filed. Injunction requested. Proceed with Onyx preparations. The pieces were falling into place. The first move in our strategic game had been Curtis's cruel text during my father's funeral. The countermove was now mine, and Curtis had no idea what was coming. Henderson Tech Solutions occupied 3 floors of the glass and steel Millennium Tower downtown. I had helped select the location 3 years earlier, recognizing that the prestigious address would lend credibility to Curtis's growing company. The building's soaring atrium featured a coffee shop with an excellent view of the main entrance, the perfect place for me to wait. Curtis didn't know I was there, of course. As far as he was concerned, I was still secluded in grief at my father's house, hopefully reviewing his divorce papers. He had no idea I was sipping a latte, watching the main entrance at precisely 2:15 p.m. when Bobby Chen's process server, a tall woman in a tailored suit, entered the building. My phone buzzed with a text from the process server. In the elevator. Receptionist confirmed he's in his office. I set my phone down and waited. The legal documents would be delivered in full view of Henderson Tech's reception area, a strategic decision. In the corporate world, perception was reality. And the perception of a CEO being served divorce papers with a temporary injunction against making business decisions would ripple through the company within hours. 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed again. Delivery complete. Subject visibly agitated. Requested privacy denied. Documents served in reception area with witnesses. I smiled slightly, imagining the scene. Curtis prided himself on controlling his image. Being served legal papers that challenged his authority, both personal and professional, in front of his employees, would be particularly galling. As if on cue, my phone rang. Curtis. I let it ring through to voicemail, then listened to his message. What the hell is this, Ayame? An injunction? Financial disclosure? Have you lost your mind? Call me back immediately. His voice held that familiar tone, controlled anger masking panic, the voice he used when things weren't going according to his plan. I had heard it often during our marriage, usually when a business deal was faltering. I texted Bobby. Delivery confirmed. Curtis called, proceeding as planned. Bobby's response came quickly. Judge Johnson reviewing injunction request. Decision. Expected by tomorrow morning. Perfect timing. If the injunction was granted, and with Judge Johnson's history with my father, I felt confident it would be, Curtis would be legally prevented from finalizing any investment deal until our divorce. Proceedings included full financial disclosure. Meanwhile, according to Ansel, Tom Regent had already instructed his team to delay their scheduled meeting with Henderson Tech, citing concerns about financial projections that require further investigation. Curtis's carefully constructed timeline was unraveling, and he still had no idea why. I left the coffee shop and headed to my next appointment, a meeting with Elena Ross, Henderson Tech's head of product development. Elena didn't know she was meeting me. She thought she was having coffee with a potential investor interested in her expertise. The investor was actually me, using my maiden name. Gaining insight from Henderson Tech's employees without raising suspicion was a crucial part of our strategy. Elena, according to my research, was brilliant but undervalued. Her innovations often credited to others, typically men, in the company. She would have unique perspective on both the company's actual technological position and its internal culture. As I drove to the meeting, my phone buzzed repeatedly with texts and calls from Curtis. I ignored them all. Strategic silence remained my most powerful tool at this stage. The cafe where I'd arranged to meet Elena was deliberately chosen, far enough from Henderson Tech's offices to be discreet, upscale enough to signal serious investment interest. I arrived early, selected a quiet corner table, and waited. Elena arrived precisely on time, a woman in her early 30s with intelligent eyes and a cautious demeanor. I recognized her from company events where she had been introduced as a team member rather than by her actual title. Ms. Ross, I'm Ayame Foster, I said, using my maiden name as we shook hands. Thank you for meeting me. Your message mentioned interest in Henderson Tech's development pipeline, she said, getting directly to business. Among other things, I replied. I represent investors who are considering Henderson Tech as a potential opportunity, but we have some concerns about the company's internal structure and leadership. Elena's expression remained carefully neutral. but I noticed a slight tensing in her shoulders. What kind of concerns? The kind that someone in your position might have unique insight into, I said. Everything discussed here is confidential. Of course. For the next hour, Elena provided a candid assessment of Henderson Tech's technological position, stronger than Curtis represented in some areas, significantly weaker in others. More tellingly, she described a corporate culture where women's contributions were systematically minimized, where loyalty to Curtis was valued above innovation, and where financial pressures were creating increasing internal strain. The Regent. Investment is supposed to solve everything, she said toward the end of our conversation, but many of us are skeptical. Throwing money at structural problems rarely fixes them. And if the Regent investment doesn't happen? I asked. Elena sighed. Then we have maybe 2 months of operating capital left. Curtis has put everything into expansion with very little reserve. As we concluded our meeting, I handed Elena my card. Not a Henderson Tech spouse card, but a new one identifying me as a consultant with Whitman Venture Capital. If things change at Henderson Tech, for better or worse, I'd be interested in continuing our conversation, I said. Elena studied the card thoughtfully. You're not really just an investor, are you? I smiled. Let's just say I have a vested interest in seeing Henderson Tech achieve its full potential, with the right leadership. As I drove back to my father's house, my phone rang again. Curtis. This time, I answered. Where have you been? He demanded without preamble. Do you have any idea what you've done with this injunction nonsense? Hello, Curtis, I replied calmly. I received your divorce papers during my father's funeral. I've had time to review them with my attorney. We found your proposed settlement inadequate. This isn't about the settlement, he snapped. It's about the timing. I have critical business decisions that can't wait for some drawn-out financial disclosure. You mean the Regent investment? I asked innocently. There was a pause. Then, how do you know about Regent? I know many things you assume I don't, Curtis. That's becoming a pattern. Ayame, be reasonable. Henderson Tech employs 50 people. Their livelihoods depend on this investment going through. I'm being perfectly reasonable, I replied. All I'm asking for is full financial disclosure before any major business decisions are made. Standard procedure in a divorce involving significant assets. There's nothing standard about this, his voice rose. You've never shown any interest in the business side of things before. Another miscalculation on your part, I said, echoing my thoughts from days earlier. What's that supposed to mean? It means the injunction hearing is tomorrow morning. I suggest you prepare your financial disclosures rather than wasting time trying to intimidate me. I ended the call before he could respond, then texted Ansel. Curtis is panicking. Time to introduce Onyx Innovations. The county courthouse was a familiar space to me. I had spent countless hours there during law school, watching my father preside over cases with unwavering fairness. Now, I walked its marble halls as a petitioner, aware of the curious glances from attorneys and clerks who recognized me as Judge Foster's daughter. Bobby Chen met me at the entrance to Courtroom C, where Judge Marcus Johnson would hear our injunction request. Bobby looked impeccable in a charcoal suit, his expression confident. Curtis's attorney filed an emergency motion to deny the injunction. He informed me quietly as we walked. Claims it would cause irreparable harm to Henderson Tech's business operations. As expected, I replied. Have they provided the financial disclosures? Partial ones at best. They're stalling, hoping to get the injunction lifted before having to reveal everything. We entered the courtroom to find Curtis already seated at the respondent's table with his attorney, Richard Davenport, a divorce lawyer known for aggressive tactics and representing high-net-worth clients. Curtis wore his standard power suit, his expression carefully composed, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the barely contained agitation in his movements. He didn't look at me as Bobby, and I took our seats at the petitioner's table. Judge Johnson entered, and the bailiff called the court to order. The judge, a contemporary of my father's with a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency, glanced briefly at me with something like sympathy before his expression returned to professional neutrality. "Henderson versus Henderson," he announced, reviewing the papers before him. "Petition for temporary injunction pending full financial disclosure in divorce proceedings." He looked up. "Mr. Chen, as petitioner's counsel, you may begin." Bobby rose smoothly. "Your Honor, my client, Ayame Foster Henderson, received divorce papers from her husband, Curtis Henderson, during her father's funeral service last week. The proposed settlement significantly undervalues her contributions to Mr. Henderson's business success, particularly given that Mrs. Henderson suspended her own legal career to support the development of Henderson Tech Solutions. Mr. Henderson has refused to provide complete financial disclosure, particularly regarding certain business assets and pending transactions. We are simply asking that no major business decisions be finalized until proper disclosure allows for fair valuation of marital assets. Judge Johnson nodded, then turned to Curtis's attorney. "Mr. Davenport?" Richard Davenport stood, exuding practiced confidence. "Your Honor, this injunction request is both unreasonable and potentially devastating to a thriving business that employs 50 people. Mrs. Henderson has never participated in the day-to-day operations of Henderson Tech Solutions and has limited understanding of its financial structure." He paused dramatically. "Furthermore, Henderson Tech is at a critical juncture in negotiations with investors. Delaying these negotiations could irreparably damage the company's growth trajectory. We have provided preliminary financial disclosures that clearly demonstrate the fairness of Mr. Henderson's proposed settlement." I kept my expression neutral, but inwardly I noted how Davenport echoed Curtis's dismissive assessment of my business understanding, another miscalculation that would work in my favor. "Judge," Johnson reviewed the documents before him. "Mr. Davenport, these financial disclosures are indeed preliminary at best. There's no detailed accounting of Henderson Tech's current valuation, pending deals, or complete asset listing. We're preparing those documents, Your Honor, but they take time to compile. Meanwhile, this injunction would effectively prevent Mr. Henderson from running his company." "Not at all," Bobby countered. "The injunction merely prevents finalizing major investment or acquisition deals without court approval until financial disclosure is complete. Day-to-day operations would continue unaffected." Judge Johnson seemed to consider this, then turned to Curtis directly. "Mr. Henderson, how quickly can you provide complete financial disclosure for all personal and business assets?" Curtis shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, as my counsel explained, compiling comprehensive financial documentation for a tech company with multiple product lines and international clients is complex. It could take weeks." "I see," Judge Johnson replied, his tone suggesting he saw more than Curtis might like. "And these investor negotiations Mr. Davenport mentioned, how imminent are they?" Curtis hesitated, caught between contradicting his attorney's urgency claims and admitting the negotiations couldn't wait for financial disclosure. "We have interested parties currently conducting due diligence. Timing is sensitive, Judge." Johnson nodded, then delivered his ruling with the decisive clarity I remembered from my father. "The court grants the temporary injunction. Mr. Henderson is prohibited from finalizing any major business transactions, including investment deals or acquisitions exceeding $50,000, without either Mrs. Henderson's written consent or court approval following complete financial disclosure." Curtis's face darkened, but Judge Johnson wasn't finished. "Mr. Henderson, you have 7 business days to provide complete financial disclosure of all personal and business assets. Failure to comply will result in additional restrictions." He fixed Curtis with a stern look. "This court takes a dim view of attempting to rush divorce proceedings to facilitate business deals, particularly when one party is grieving the loss of a parent. The gavel fell, and Curtis immediately turned to confer with his attorney, still avoiding looking at me directly. As Bobby and I exited the courtroom, my phone buzzed with a text from Ansel. Onyx Innovations reaching out to Henderson Tech today. Tom Regent officially withdrew interest this morning. Perfect timing. Curtis's world was contracting and expanding simultaneously, losing his expected investor while gaining an unexpected one, all while his legal and financial control diminished. Outside the courthouse, Curtis finally approached me, stepping directly into my path as I prepared to leave. "I hope you're satisfied," he said, his voice low and tense. "You've just put the company at risk over what? Spite? Revenge for the timing of the divorce papers?" I met his gaze calmly. "This isn't about spite, Curtis. It's about accurate valuation of assets, including my contribution to building Henderson Tech." "Your contribution?" he scoffed. "You hosted dinner parties and managed the household calendar. I built the technology, secured the clients, created the business model." "Is that really how you see it?" I asked, genuinely curious about his perception. "You never once considered that my legal background might be relevant to contract negotiations? That my social connections brought in half your initial clients? That the algorithm I helped refine made your supply chain management system marketable?" Confusion flickered across his face. "That's not—" "It is," I interrupted. "And that's exactly why this injunction matters. You've fundamentally misunderstood my role and contribution for years." I moved to step around him. "You should focus on preparing those financial disclosures, Curtis. 7 days isn't much time." "Regent pulled out this morning," he said abruptly, an edge of desperation in his voice. "We need that investment to continue operations beyond the next quarter." I paused, allowing a hint of compassion to enter my expression. "Then I suggest you explore other options quickly. The injunction doesn't prevent new negotiations, just finalizing deals without proper disclosure." As I walked away, I heard Curtis's phone ring. I didn't need to look back to know it would be Henderson Tech's receptionist, informing him that representatives from a previously unknown investment group called Onyx Innovations had requested a meeting. The next phase was beginning, right on schedule. Onyx Innovations was a masterpiece of corporate illusion. Within 48 hours, Ansel's team had created a complete corporate identity, website, business profiles, digital footprint, for a company that didn't actually exist. The site featured sleek design, carefully worded mission statements about identifying transformative technologies, and professional biographies of executives who were actually Whitman Venture Capital employees using pseudonyms. From my father's study, which had become my command center, I monitored the approach to Henderson Tech through a series of texts and calls with Ansel. "Meeting set for 2 p.m., he informed me. Curtis moved his entire schedule to accommodate us after hearing about Regent's withdrawal. I smiled at the predictability. Curtis always responded to pressure by accelerating rather than reassessing, a tendency I was counting on. "Remember," I texted back, "initial offer should be exactly what he needs, but with terms just uncomfortable enough to make him hesitate." "Tom and Sarah are thoroughly prepared," Ansel replied, referring to the Whitman employees who would represent Onyx. "They'll report back immediately after." While waiting for news of the meeting, I focused on another critical aspect of our strategy. I had engaged a forensic accountant, Dr. Layla Patel, one of my father's expert witnesses in financial fraud cases, to analyze what we already knew about Henderson Tech's finances. Dr. Patel's preliminary findings had confirmed my suspicions. Curtis had been systematically undervaluing company assets in his divorce filing, while simultaneously inflating projections for potential investors. More concerning, she had identified transfers to offshore accounts that appeared designed to shield assets from both tax authorities and divorce proceedings. This information needed careful handling. Exposed too soon, Curtis might find ways to cover his tracks. Held too long, it might not serve its strategic purpose. Timing, as my father always said, was everything. My phone rang. Bobby Chen. Judge Johnson was more decisive than we expected, he said without preamble. He's granted our motion for expedited discovery, which means Curtis must provide complete financial records within 7 days, instead of the usual 30. How did Davenport respond? Filed an immediate objection, claimed it was impossible to compile everything that quickly. Judge Johnson wasn't sympathetic. Said if Henderson Tech's financial systems were as sophisticated as they claimed in their marketing materials, producing records should be trivially simple. I smiled at the judge's perception. Curtis will have to choose between admitting financial disorganization or complying quickly. Either way, it works in our favor, Bobby agreed. Oh, and Davenport tried to introduce a motion restricting you from contacting Henderson Tech employees. Judge Johnson denied it unless they can show actual interference. That was useful information. It meant Curtis was concerned about me reaching out to his staff. Perhaps he'd heard about my meeting with Elena, or perhaps he simply feared what his employees might reveal. As I ended the call with Bobby, a text came through from Ansel. Meeting. Concluded. Sending Tom and Sarah to brief you in person? Curtis's reaction exactly as anticipated. 30 minutes later, Tom Peters and Sarah Liu, the Whitman employees who had represented Onyx Innovations, arrived at my father's house. They looked perfectly cast as tech investors, from their business casual attire to their understated but expensive accessories. Curtis was visibly relieved when we expressed interest, Sarah began as we settled in the study. The desperation was thinly veiled behind standard CEO confidence. Tom nodded in agreement. We presented exactly as planned, an investment group specifically interested in supply chain management technology, impressed by Henderson Tech's innovations, concerned about certain financial indicators. His response? I asked. Defensive. About the financials, though he tried to disguise it as growth-focused strategy, Sarah replied. He admitted Regent's withdrawal, but framed it as a mutual decision to pursue different directions. When we mentioned the specific investment amount, exactly what Dr. Patel calculated he needs for the next 6 months of operations, his eyes literally widened, Tom added. It was clearly the figure he needed to hear. And the terms? I asked. That's when things got interesting, Sarah said, a slight smile playing at her lips. We presented the first stage terms, capital injection in exchange for board representation, and oversight of major financial decisions. Curtis initially balked, said Henderson Tech has always maintained founder control. But then we mentioned that we're considering several investments in the sector, and this was just an initial discussion, Tom continued. His demeanor shifted immediately. He became much more accommodating, asked what would be needed to move forward expeditiously. Which is when we introduced the second stage terms, Sarah added. Due diligence completed within 2 weeks, restructured board with Onyx Holding, 3 of 7 seats, comprehensive audit of all financial systems before finalizing. I nodded, picturing Curtis's reaction. He would hate the loss of control, but would be trapped by his financial timeline. And his response? He said he needs to consult with his team, but he's already scheduled a follow-up meeting for tomorrow, Tom replied. And he asked repeatedly about our timeline for finalizing the investment. Did he mention the injunction? I asked. Sarah nodded. Near the end. Said there was a temporary legal matter that might require court approval for finalizing any investment, but assured us it was a formality that wouldn't impact the company's operations. Minimizing as expected, I murmured. Did he ask about Onyx's background or investors? Repeatedly, Tom confirmed. We gave the prepared responses. Private investment group, confidential limited partners, specializing in undervalued tech companies with strong intellectual property. He tried to research us during the meeting, Sarah added with a slight smirk. I saw him searching on his phone under the table. The Onyx digital footprint you created held up perfectly. I felt a sense of satisfaction at how precisely our strategy was unfolding. Curtis was responding exactly as predicted, pursuing the Onyx opportunity with minimal due diligence because he was desperate for capital, while simultaneously trying to circumvent the injunction's restrictions. "What's our next move?" Tom asked. "Maintain exactly this posture," I replied. "Interested but discerning. Willing to move quickly but requiring transparency. Curtis needs to believe Onyx is his salvation, but with conditions just uncomfortable enough to keep him off balance." As Tom and Sarah left to prepare for tomorrow's follow-up meeting, my phone buzzed with a text from Curtis, the first direct communication since our courthouse encounter. "We need to discuss the injunction. I have potential investors who can save the company, but your legal maneuvers are creating obstacles. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about the livelihoods of 50 employees. Call me." I set the phone down without responding. Curtis was now exactly where I needed him to be, desperate enough to make concessions, constrained by legal requirements, and unaware of who was really behind Onyx Innovations. The pieces were aligning perfectly. Strategic patience was a lesson my father had taught me throughout my childhood. "The law moves at its own pace," he would say. "Those who try to rush it often trip over their own eagerness." As I monitored Curtis's increasingly frantic attempts to simultaneously court Onyx Innovations and circumvent the injunction, I remembered those words. 3 days had passed since the injunction hearing. Curtis had called 6 times and sent 14 text messages, each more urgent than the last. I maintained my deliberate silence, allowing his anxiety to build. Meanwhile, Onyx representatives had conducted a second meeting at Henderson Tech, requesting detailed financial information that Curtis was reluctant but desperate to provide. My phone buzzed with a call from Elena Ross, Henderson Tech's head of product development, whom I'd met previously under my maiden name. "Ms. Foster?" she said when I answered, her voice low as if she were calling from somewhere private. "This is Elena Ross from Henderson Tech. We met last week." "I remember," I replied. "Is everything all right?" "There's something strange happening here," she said. "Curtis called an emergency management meeting yesterday. He's pushing everyone to accelerate development timelines, clean up financial documentation, and prepare for significant structural changes. He mentioned new investors, but he's being unusually secretive about who they are." This was valuable information. Curtis was preparing Henderson Tech for Onyx's due diligence while trying to present a more organized operation than actually existed. "Has he mentioned the legal injunction?" I asked. "Not directly, but Richard from legal has been in Curtis's office for hours every day. The rumor is there's some legal obstacle to finalizing the investment." She paused. "Also, Curtis has been asking unusual questions about who I've spoken with recently. It felt targeted." "Thank you for telling me," I said. "If you feel your position is at risk in any way, please let me know." "That's not why I called," Elena replied, her voice stronger now. "I called because I finally looked you up. Ayami Foster, Henderson. You're Curtis's wife." I hadn't expected this development so soon, but I remained calm. "Yes, we're currently separated. And you're obviously involved in whatever's happening with the company." It wasn't a question. I don't care about the personal drama, but I do care about the future of my team and our technology. Are you trying to destroy Henderson Tech? Quite the opposite, I assured her. I'm trying to ensure it fulfills its potential with proper leadership and financial management. There was a long pause. I've watched Curtis take credit for other people's innovations for years, Elena finally said. Especially women's work. Whatever you're doing. Well, let's just say I'm not the only one who wouldn't mind seeing some accountability. After ending the call, I contacted Bobby Chen to update him on the situation at Henderson Tech. Curtis filed a motion to modify the injunction this morning, Bobby informed me. Claims he needs to secure emergency funding to maintain operations and can't wait for complete financial disclosure. Exactly as expected, I replied. What's our counter? We've already filed it. We're not opposing modification of the injunction. We're simply requesting that any investment agreement be reviewed by the court before finalization, with our forensic accountant allowed to examine the terms. This approach was strategically calibrated. By not directly opposing the modification, we appeared reasonable while still maintaining oversight. Curtis would be caught between revealing the Onyx deal to the court and our scrutiny, or abandoning his best funding option. Later, that afternoon, Ansel called with an update from the Onyx team's second meeting. Curtis is getting desperate, he reported. He's offering additional equity to speed up the process, practically begging for a preliminary commitment letter he can show to interested parties. By which he means the court, I noted. Precisely. Sarah told him Onyx requires full financial transparency before issuing any commitment letters. He practically turned gray. And the forensic audit requirement? He tried to negotiate it down to a standard review, but Tom held firm. Curtis finally agreed but requested the audit be conducted by a firm of his choosing. Tom countered that Onyx would select from a list of 3 reputable firms. Curtis reluctantly accepted. I smiled at the precision of our approach. Each concession Curtis made pulled him further into our carefully constructed web. The due diligence team should focus particularly on the offshore accounts Dr. Patel identified, I instructed. But don't reveal we know about them yet. That evening, my phone rang again. Curtis's attorney, Richard Davenport. Mrs. Henderson, he began formally. I'm calling to propose a settlement conference. My client is prepared to make significant concessions to resolve this matter quickly. What kind of concessions? I asked. Although I already knew what was coming, an increased settlement figure, 15% of Henderson Tech's current valuation instead of 10%, plus the house and all personal property. I almost laughed at the minimal increase. Mr. Davenport, your client's definition of significant needs recalibration. What else? Davenport cleared his throat. In exchange, Mr. Henderson requests immediate lifting of the injunction to allow for a pending investment opportunity. The mysterious Onyx innovations? I asked innocently. There was a pause. You're aware of them? I make it my business to be informed, Mr. Davenport, and my answer is no. I won't accept an arbitrary percentage based on a valuation your client controls. I require full financial disclosure as ordered by the court. Mrs. Henderson? Davenport's tone grew sharper. Your insistence on this injunction is jeopardizing Henderson Tech's future. If the company fails due to inability to secure investment, there will be nothing left to divide in the divorce. Then perhaps your client should provide the court-ordered financial disclosure more quickly, I suggested. Judge Johnson gave him 7 days. It's been 3. After ending the call with Davenport, I sent a text to Bobby. Settlement offer made and rejected. 15% and lifting the injunction. Bobby's response came quickly. Predictable and inadequate. Curtis filed financial disclosures today, clearly rushed and incomplete. Judge Johnson has scheduled a hearing for day after tomorrow to review compliance. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Curtis was attempting to resolve the situation through increasingly desperate measures, offering slightly better settlement terms, filing incomplete financial disclosures, pushing for modification of the injunction. Meanwhile, Onyx Innovations continued to present itself as Henderson Tech's potential salvation, always just out of reach unless Curtis met their increasingly demanding conditions. The pressure was building exactly as designed, forcing Curtis to make mistakes that would ultimately reveal the true nature of Henderson Tech's finances and his deliberate undervaluation of my contribution. My phone buzzed with yet another text from Curtis. This is ridiculous. You're going to destroy everything we built because of a petty grudge over divorce timing. The company needs this investment to survive. Name your price. I set the phone down without responding, smiling slightly at his choice of words. Everything we built, he had said, finally acknowledging my contribution, however unintentionally. Progress, however small, was still progress. The hearing to review Curtis's financial disclosures was scheduled for 9 a.m. in Judge Johnson's courtroom. I arrived early with Bobby Chen, armed with Dr. Patel's preliminary analysis of the documents Curtis had hastily submitted. His disclosures are deliberately incomplete, Dr. Patel had concluded in her report. Key accounts are missing, international holdings are undisclosed, and the company valuation relies on outdated projections that significantly understate current worth. Bobby and I reviewed our strategy one final time before entering the courtroom. Curtis and Richard Davenport were already there, Curtis looking noticeably more disheveled than usual. The perfectly pressed suits and immaculate appearance that had been his trademark were showing signs of strain, his tie slightly askew, faint shadows under his eyes suggesting sleepless nights. Judge Johnson entered, and the proceedings began, with Davenport arguing that Curtis had complied with the court's order for financial disclosure. My client has provided comprehensive documentation of Henderson Tech's finances and personal assets, Davenport insisted. Any suggestion of incomplete disclosure is simply Mrs. Henderson's attempt to delay proceedings and further damage the company's ability to secure necessary investment. Bobby rose in response. Your Honor, we've had our forensic accountant review Mr. Henderson's disclosures. Her report, which I've submitted to the court, identifies numerous omissions and inconsistencies. He proceeded to methodically outline the missing information, including the offshore accounts and undervalued assets. Judge Johnson reviewed Dr. Patel's report with growing concern, occasionally glancing at Curtis with the same expression my father used when he suspected a witness wasn't being entirely truthful. Mr. Henderson, the judge finally said, these disclosures appear to be significantly incomplete. Dr. Patel has identified at least 3 accounts that don't appear in your documentation, as well as a concerning pattern of asset transfers over the past 6 months. Curtis leaned forward, his expression a careful blend of confusion and concern. Your Honor, I provided everything my financial team prepared. If there are discrepancies, they're clerical errors, not deliberate omissions. It was a clever attempt to distance himself from the incomplete disclosures by blaming his financial team. I had anticipated this defense. It was classic Curtis, deflecting responsibility when confronted with mistakes. Judge Johnson wasn't impressed. Mr. Henderson, as CEO of a technology company and the primary financial decision-maker in your marriage, the court expects more than clerical errors in your compliance with direct orders. He turned to study Dr. Patel's report again before continuing. The court finds Mr. Henderson's financial disclosures inadequate and potentially misleading. I'm ordering complete and verified disclosures within 48 hours, to include all accounts identified in Dr. Patel's report, plus any others not yet disclosed. Curtis visibly paled. 48 hours was barely enough time to compile the information, let alone sanitize it as he had clearly attempted to do with the initial disclosures. Furthermore, Judge Johnson continued, given these concerning omissions, the temporary injunction will remain in full effect. Any pending investment deals must be submitted to the court for review before finalization. As we exited the courtroom, Curtis intercepted me in the hallway, moving quickly to block my path. This is going too far, he said, keeping his voice low but intense. You know what's at stake here. Henderson Tech will collapse without this investment, and your precious settlement will be worth nothing. I met his gaze calmly. Then provide accurate financial disclosures and submit the investment deal for court review. If everything is as straightforward as you claim, there should be no problem. The Onyx deal is time-sensitive, he insisted. They have other options they're considering. If we don't move quickly, they'll invest elsewhere. That sounds like a negotiating tactic I've heard you use before, I observed. Create artificial time pressure to force concessions. Frustration flashed across his face. This isn't a game. Ayame, real jobs, real livelihoods are at stake. I'm well aware, I replied, which is why I want to ensure any investment deal properly values the company and protects its future, and my interest in it. Before he could respond, my phone buzzed with a text from Ansel. Onyx team reports Curtis just called, sounding desperate. Wants to accelerate timeline. Mentioned legal complications being resolved soon. I suppressed a smile as I put my phone away. Curtis was clearly trying to pressure both sides simultaneously, telling me the Onyx deal couldn't wait while telling Onyx the legal issues would soon be resolved. I need to go, I told Curtis. I suggest you focus on providing accurate financial disclosures this time. Judge Johnson's patience is clearly wearing thin. Back at my father's house, I convened a strategy meeting with Ansel, Bobby, and Dr. Patel. The next 48 hours would be critical. Once Curtis provided complete financial disclosures, or failed to, we would have all the leverage we needed for the final phase of our plan. Curtis is panicking, Ansel reported. He's offering Onyx increasingly favorable terms, practically giving away control of the company in exchange for immediate investment. Which plays perfectly into our strategy, I noted. The more desperate he becomes, the more concessions he'll make to Onyx. Concessions that will ultimately benefit us when the truth is revealed. Dr. Patel reviewed her latest findings. Based on what I've already uncovered, Curtis has been systematically undervaluing Henderson Tech's intellectual property while overvaluing its physical assets, a classic technique to manipulate company. Valuation during divorce proceedings. And the offshore accounts? I asked. 3 confirmed so far, with substantial transfers over the past year. Nothing explicitly illegal, but certainly questionable in the context of divorce proceedings and investor disclosures. Bobby added his legal perspective. Once the complete disclosures are submitted, assuming Curtis complies, we'll have everything we need to demonstrate deliberate undervaluation of marital assets. That alone could justify a significant adjustment to the settlement, possibly up to 40–50% of the company's true value. But that's not our primary objective, I reminded them. Control is more valuable than percentage ownership. Our strategy session was interrupted by a text from Elena Ross. Emergency board meeting called for tomorrow morning. Curtis telling directors the future of the company depends on an investment deal that's being obstructed by personal legal matters. Thought you should know. I shared this information with the team. Curtis is trying to rally the board to pressure me. He's portraying me as the obstacle to the company's salvation, rather than acknowledging his own financial mismanagement. How do you want to respond? Ansel asked. I considered our options carefully. It's time to accelerate our timeline slightly. Have the Onyx team contact Curtis immediately after his board meeting. Tell them they're ready to proceed with final terms, but require one additional condition, a meeting with all key technical personnel without Curtis present, to evaluate the true value of Henderson Tech's intellectual property. He'll hate that, Ansel noted with a slight smile. Exactly, but he'll be too desperate to refuse. As the meeting concluded, I felt a sense of calm certainty. Everything was proceeding according to plan, with Curtis reacting exactly as anticipated at every stage. His desperation was growing, his options narrowing, and his control slipping away, all while he remained completely unaware of who was really behind Onyx Innovations. The next phase would bring us one step closer to the final revelation. The Henderson Tech Solutions conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, a view I had helped select for its ability to impress clients and investors. Today, that same view served as the backdrop for a critical meeting between the Onyx Innovations team and Henderson Tech's key technical personnel, a meeting deliberately scheduled while Curtis was occupied with completing his court-ordered financial disclosures. I wasn't physically present, of course, but I monitored the situation through regular updates from Sarah Liu, who was leading the Onyx team. The meeting had been strategically designed to accomplish 2 objectives: gather unfiltered information about Henderson Tech's true technological capabilities, and create a sense of alliance between Onyx and the technical team, separate from Curtis's influence. Technical assessment underway, Sarah texted. Elena leading discussion. Curtis tried to join, but Tom intercepted him with investor questions in his office. Perfect. Tom Peters would keep Curtis occupied while Sarah conducted the technical evaluation without his controlling presence. Meanwhile, Bobby Chen was at the courthouse, monitoring the submission of Curtis's complete financial disclosures. The 48-hour deadline was approaching, and according to Bobby, Curtis's legal team had been working frantically to compile the required documentation. "Financial disclosure package just submitted," Bobby texted. "Much more substantial than the Yao first version. Dr. Patel is reviewing now." The pieces were falling into place exactly as planned. With Curtis distracted by multiple pressures, the court deadline, the Onyx meeting, the board's concerns, he was unable to maintain the careful control that had characterized his management style. My phone rang. Elena Ross. "They're gone," she said without preamble. "The Onyx team just left after a 3-hour deep dive into our technology." "How did it go?" I asked. "Honestly, it was the most thorough and intelligent assessment we've ever had from potential investors. They actually understood the technology, asked insightful questions, and seemed genuinely interested in our development roadmap." She paused. "Very different from the usual investors Curtis brings in, who focus only on market size and revenue projections." "And the team's response to them?" "Overwhelmingly positive. Even the most skeptical engineers were impressed." Another pause. "Curtis is furious, though. He tried repeatedly to join the meeting, but they insisted on speaking with the technical team directly. When he finally got in at the end, it was clear he'd been excluded from substantive discussions. This was exactly the dynamic I had hoped to create, establishing Onyx as an ally to the technical team while positioning Curtis as an obstacle to transparent assessment. "What happens next?" Elena asked. "That depends partly on you and your team," I replied. "How would you feel about a significant change in company leadership?" Her answer came without hesitation. "If it means working with people who actually understand and value what we're building, we'd welcome it." After ending the call with Elena, I received an update from Dr. Patel about Curtis's financial disclosures. "Complete. Review will take time, but initial assessment confirms our suspicions. The offshore accounts contain approximately $3.7 million not disclosed in the first submission. Company valuation understated by at least 30% through creative accounting. Detailed report by evening." With this information, we had everything needed. For the next phase, I called Ansel to coordinate timing. "The technical assessment was a success," I informed him. "The team is favorably disposed toward Onyx and increasingly frustrated with Curtis." "Tom reports the same," Ansel replied. Curtis was agitated throughout their meeting, checking his phone constantly, clearly worried about what was happening with the technical team. "And the financial disclosures confirm significant undervaluation and hidden assets," I added. "We're ready for the next step. The investment proposal?" "Yes, but with a twist. Instead of just offering financing with board control, Onyx should propose a complete leadership restructuring. A new CEO with Curtis remaining as Chief Innovation Officer. Frame it as necessary to satisfy investor concerns about financial management, while recognizing his technical vision." Ansel considered this. "He'll resist losing the CEO position." "Of course, but he's running out of options. Regent has withdrawn. The board is concerned. The court is scrutinizing his finances, and the company needs capital within weeks. He'll negotiate hard, but ultimately accept if it's the only path to save the company." "And when do we reveal your involvement?" "Not yet," I replied. "Let him accept the terms first. The revelation will be more powerful once he's legally committed." That evening, we gathered at my father's house to review all developments. Dr. Patel presented her complete analysis of Curtis's financial disclosures, confirming systematic undervaluation of company assets and questionable financial management. Based on proper accounting standards, Henderson Tech is worth approximately 40% more than the valuation Curtis presented in his initial divorce filing, she concluded. Additionally, The offshore accounts contain funds that appear to have been deliberately shielded from both tax authorities and divorce proceedings. Bobby Chen outlined the legal implications. This gives us significant leverage. Judge Johnson has already expressed concern about Curtis's incomplete disclosures. This evidence of deliberate undervaluation would likely result in punitive measures in divorce proceedings. But we're not going to bring this to the judge immediately, I clarified. It's more valuable as leverage in the Onyx negotiations. Tom and Sarah provided their assessment of Henderson Tech's technical capabilities, confirming what I had suspected. The company's core technology was innovative and valuable, but its financial management and leadership structure were deeply flawed. The technical team is impressive, Sarah reported. They've developed genuinely innovative solutions with minimal resources. With proper leadership and financial support, Henderson Tech could be significantly more successful. And the team's loyalty appears to be to their technology, and each other not to Curtis, Tom added. Eleanor Ross, in particular, commands tremendous respect from the engineers. As our strategy session concluded, a text came through from Ansel, who had been meeting with Henderson Tech's board members confidentially. Board increasingly concerned about Curtis's leadership. 2 members independently asked about the possibility of new management as part of investment deal. Groundwork laid for leadership change proposal. I smiled at how perfectly all elements were aligning. Curtis had built a company culture where he took credit for others' work, maintained control through intimidation rather than leadership, and treated financial management as a tool for personal enrichment rather than company stability. Now that same culture was turning against him, with board members, technical staff, and investors all questioning his leadership while he remained oblivious to the true forces at work. My phone buzzed with yet another text from Curtis. Financial disclosures. Submitted as ordered. I've met all court requirements. Now lift the injunction so we can close this investment deal. Henderson Tech won't survive another month without capital. Once again, I didn't respond. Curtis's desperation was palpable, his demand reflecting his fundamental misunderstanding of both the legal process and his position. The injunction couldn't simply be lifted by my decision. It required court action based on compliance with financial disclosure requirements. More importantly, he still had no idea that his potential savior, Onyx Innovations, was actually the instrument of his reckoning. Tomorrow, Onyx would present its leadership restructuring proposal, forcing Curtis to choose between his ego and the company's survival. The choice would define everything that followed. The Henderson Tech boardroom was set for the most important meeting in the company's history. Onyx Innovations representatives would present their formal investment proposal, the proposal that could either save the company or fundamentally transform it, depending on one's perspective. I monitored developments from my father's study, receiving regular updates from Ansel, who was attending as a special advisor to Onyx, a role that allowed him to observe without raising questions about his connection to me. Board members all present, Ansel texted. Curtis trying to project confidence, but clearly anxious. CFO looks terrified, keeps checking financial projections on his tablet. The company's financial situation had deteriorated exactly as we had projected. Without new investment, Henderson Tech would be unable to meet its next payroll, a fact the CFO knew but Curtis had attempted to conceal from the board. Onyx team arriving now, came Ansel's next update. Tom and Sarah plus 2 financial analysts. Very professional entrance. Curtis practically jumping to greet them. I could picture the scene perfectly. Curtis employing his practiced charm, the desperate CEO disguised as the confident visionary. It was a performance I had witnessed countless times at investor meetings and client presentations. Meanwhile, Bobby Chen was at the courthouse, waiting for Judge Johnson's ruling on Curtis's updated financial disclosures. The timing had been carefully coordinated. The judge's decision would likely come during the Onyx presentation, adding another layer of pressure to Curtis's already precarious position. My phone rang. Bobby, Judge Johnson has reviewed the updated disclosures, he reported. He's satisfied with the completeness but troubled by the discrepancies between the first and second submissions. He's maintaining the injunction with one modification. Curtis can proceed with investment negotiations, but must submit any final agreement for court approval before signing. Perfect, I replied. That gives us exactly the leverage we need for the next phase. I relayed this information to Ansel, who would ensure it reached Tom and Sarah at the appropriate moment in their presentation. For the next hour, I waited for updates, reviewing our strategy one final time. Every element had been carefully calibrated to bring us to this moment, the moment when Curtis would have to choose between his ego and his company's survival. Presentation underway, Ansel texted. First phase standard investment overview, $7.5 million capital injection. Curtis nodding eagerly. This initial figure was deliberately calculated. Exactly what Henderson Tech needed to stabilize operations for the next 6 months, but not enough for significant expansion. The amount would save the company, but keep Curtis dependent on Onyx's continuing support. Second phase governance changes introduced. New board structure with Onyx majority. Curtis frowning but still engaged. The board restructuring had been anticipated. Curtis would resist, but ultimately accepted as necessary to secure funding. The real test would come with the next phase. Leadership restructuring proposal presented. Curtis as CIO, new CEO to be appointed by Onyx. His face just went blank. This was the pivot point, the moment when Curtis realized he would lose his title and public role as CEO. For someone whose identity was so thoroughly wrapped up in his position, this would be nearly unendurable. Curtis objecting strenuously. Claiming company needs his leadership. Tom calmly explaining investor confidence requires financial management expertise Curtis hasn't demonstrated. I could imagine the scene. Curtis becoming increasingly agitated while Tom maintained professional composure, presenting the leadership change not as a punitive measure, but as a necessary condition for investment. Board members surprisingly quiet, not defending Curtis. CFO actually nodded at mention of financial management expertise. This was significant. The board's silence indicated they shared concerns about Curtis's leadership, particularly regarding financial matters. His isolation was growing. Tom. Just mentioned court injunction. Explained Onyx aware of legal constraints, prepared to work within them, but cannot proceed without leadership change. The strategic introduction of the legal situation would force Curtis to acknowledge his constraints publicly, another blow to his carefully maintained image of control. Curtis requested brief recess to consider options. Board agreed. Meeting paused for 15 minutes. This was expected. Curtis always sought private space when losing control of a situation. He would use this time to search for alternatives, only to realize he had none. While waiting for the meeting to resume, I received a text from Eleanor Ross. Technical. Team assembled in conference room B. Curtis asked us to demonstrate our support when meeting reconvenes. Team discussing whether to comply. Most inclined to support leadership change if it preserves jobs. I replied immediately, your team should make their own decision. Whatever happens, good people with valuable skills will always have options. This subtle reminder that the technical team had value beyond Curtis's company was deliberate, planting the seed that their futures weren't dependent on his leadership. Meeting resuming, came Ansel's next update. Curtis looks composed, but tense. Has clearly made some decision. The next few minutes would determine everything. If Curtis accepted the leadership restructuring, we would proceed to the final phase of our plan. If he rejected it, Henderson Tech would likely collapse, an outcome we were prepared for but preferred to avoid. Curtis counter-proposing. Accepts. Board restructuring and financial oversight but wants to remain CEO with redefined responsibilities. Suggests compromise of co-CEOs, him for vision strategy, Onyx appointee for operations, finance. This was classic Curtis. attempting to salvage his title and public role while appearing to compromise. The co-CEO proposal was a transparent effort to maintain his perceived status while technically accepting oversight. Tom listening politely, but unmoved. Restating Onyx's position. Investment contingent on single clear leadership. Curtis as CIO focusing on technology vision. New CEO with proven financial management experience. The response was exactly as we had scripted, polite but firm, presenting the leadership change as non-negotiable. Board chair speaking now, asking Curtis directly about financial timeline. Curtis forced to admit payroll at risk without immediate investment. Mood in room shifting noticeably. This public acknowledgement of the company's precarious financial position would further undermine Curtis's negotiating leverage, both with Onyx and the board. Technical team entered, led by Elena. Curtis looking expectant. Elena spoke. We support whatever structure ensures continuing development of our technology and job security for the team, deliberately neutral. Elena's careful wording effectively denied Curtis the vocal support he had sought, another indication of his waning influence within the company he had founded. Curtis visibly deflated. Just said, I need to consult with my attorney about the implications for the court injunction. Tom reminded him that any final agreement requires court approval regardless. Curtis was running out of both options and excuses. The reality of his situation, a company on the brink of financial collapse, a board unwilling to defend his leadership, a technical team prioritizing their work over his ego, and legal constraints he couldn't circumvent, was finally becoming inescapable. Meeting concluding. Tom presented timeline. 24 hours for Curtis to accept leadership restructuring, 48 hours for court approval of investment terms, funds transferred immediately thereafter. Curtis didn't object. The lack of objection was telling. Curtis was beginning to recognize the inevitability of the changes Onyx was demanding. His options had narrowed to a simple choice: accept the loss of his CEO title or watch Henderson Tech collapse. As the participants filed out of the boardroom, my phone rang unexpectedly. Curtis. After a moment's hesitation, I answered. We need to talk, he said, his voice tense but controlled. Face to face. About the company and the injunction. I'm listening, I replied calmly. Not on the phone. In person. Tonight. Your father's house. I considered briefly. A face-to-face meeting wasn't part of our planned sequence, but it could accelerate the timeline toward our ultimate objective. 8 o'clock, I said, and ended the call. The final confrontation was approaching sooner than expected. I prepared, carefully for Curtis's visit, selecting the setting with strategic precision. My father's study, with its leather-bound law books, his judicial portrait on the wall, and the subtle power its atmosphere conveyed, would be the perfect backdrop for this confrontation. I wore a simple but elegant black dress with a single strand of pearls. My father's gift when I passed the bar exam. My appearance would communicate calm confidence rather than the emotional vulnerability Curtis likely expected. At precisely 8 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Curtis standing there, his usual polished appearance slightly diminished. His eyes held the wary calculation of a man preparing for battle while trying to project confidence. Thank you for agreeing to meet, he said as I gestured him into the house. Of course, I replied, leading him to my father's study. Would you like something to drink? Coffee? Something stronger? Scotch if you have it, he answered, glancing around the study with visible discomfort. Curtis had always been uneasy in this room, perhaps sensing my father's quiet disapproval of his controlling tendencies. I poured him a measure of my father's premium single malt, and nothing for myself. I needed complete clarity for what was to come, while a slightly relaxed Curtis might be more revealing. You wanted to talk, I said, settling into my father's chair behind the desk. The positioning was deliberate. Curtis would have to sit in the visitor's chair, a subtle reversal of the power dynamic he had maintained throughout our marriage. Curtis took a sip of scotch before speaking. I assume you've heard about the Onyx Innovations proposal? I kept my expression neutral. I'm aware there's potential investment interest in Henderson Tech. It's more than interest, he replied, leaning forward slightly. It's the company's only viable option at this point. Regent pulled out. Other investors are hesitant because of the public injunction, and we have maybe 2 weeks of operating capital left. I nodded, allowing him to continue outlining a situation I knew more intimately than he did. The problem, he continued, is that Onyx's terms include a leadership restructuring that would remove me as CEO. They claim it's about financial management expertise, but it's really about control. And this concerns you because, I asked, deliberately prompting him to articulate his priorities. Curtis frowned. Because I built Henderson Tech. It's my vision, my leadership that brought it this far. Stepping aside now it would validate misconceptions about my management. There it was. His core concern wasn't the company's survival or the employees' jobs, but his public image and perceived success. This had always been the heart of Curtis Henderson. Appearances mattered more than substance. I understand their proposal requires court approval because of the injunction, I said. He nodded. That's why I'm here. The board is pressuring me to accept Onyx's terms, but I wanted to discuss an alternative approach with you first. I'm listening. Curtis set down his glass and leaned forward. If you would agree to lift the injunction specifically for this investment deal, with some modifications to the leadership structure, I would be willing to reconsider the settlement terms. What modifications did you have in mind? I asked, already knowing the answer. A co-CEO arrangement, he replied. I would remain Chief Executive Officer focusing on strategy and vision, while accepting an Onyx-appointed Chief Operating Officer to handle financial and operational matters. I maintained my neutral expression. And the revised settlement terms? 20% of Henderson Tech's current valuation, plus the house and personal property, he offered, as if making a significant concession. That's double my initial proposal. I allowed silence to fill the room, watching Curtis grow increasingly uncomfortable as I considered his offer. Finally, I spoke. Curtis, do you know why Judge Johnson granted the injunction in the first place? He shifted slightly. Because your lawyer made compelling arguments about financial disclosure, which I've now provided. Partially, I acknowledged. But more fundamentally, because there was clear evidence that you were attempting to undervalue marital assets while simultaneously presenting a different valuation to potential investors. Curtis stiffened. That's not... It is, I interrupted calmly. The financial disclosures you finally submitted under court order reveal offshore accounts, systematic undervaluation of company assets, and questionable financial management that you deliberately concealed in your initial filing. His expression tightened as he realized I had more detailed information than he'd anticipated. The forensic accountant's analysis indicates Henderson Tech's actual value is approximately 40% higher than what you claimed in your divorce filing, I continued. Which makes your generous offer of 20% still significantly less than what would be considered fair division of marital property. Curtis's face hardened. You've been investigating me. I've been protecting my interests, I corrected. Interests that you dismissed when you texted me divorce papers during my father's funeral. He had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable. The timing was unfortunate. But that doesn't change the current reality. Henderson Tech needs this investment to survive, and Onyx won't proceed without leadership changes that I find unacceptable. I studied him for a moment. What exactly are you asking me to do, Curtis? Work with me on a counter-proposal to Onyx, he said, leaning forward earnestly. One that preserves my position as CEO while addressing their concerns about financial management. If we present a united front, with you agreeing to lift the injunction for this specific deal, They'll have to consider our terms. It was a revealing request. Even now, facing company collapse, Curtis was focused on maintaining his title and status rather than securing the investment on whatever terms would save Henderson Tech. "And if I refuse?" I asked quietly. His expression darkened. "Then Henderson Tech will likely fail within weeks. 50 people will lose their jobs. The company we built together will disappear. And your settlement, whatever percentage you ultimately receive, will be worth nothing." The implied threat was clear, yet also deeply revealing of Curtis's fundamental misunderstanding of my priorities. "You still don't understand what matters to me, do you?" I said, my voice remaining calm. "You think this is about money, about what percentage of Henderson Tech I receive in the divorce?" Curtis looked confused. "Isn't it? Why else would you push for financial disclosure and fight the settlement?" I shook my head slightly. "Because accurate valuation is about recognition of contribution, not just financial compensation. It's about acknowledging that Henderson Tech was built on my sacrificed career, my connections, my support, my ideas that you routinely claimed as your own." His expression shifted to something between defensiveness and realization. "Curtis, I will not help you maintain a CEO position that you've demonstrated you don't deserve. Not because of spite or revenge, but because it wouldn't serve the company, its employees, or its technology." I stood, indicating our meeting was concluding. "I suggest you accept Onyx's terms. A successful chief innovation officer is far better than a failed CEO." As I escorted him to the door, Curtis turned to face me, his expression a complex mixture of anger, confusion, and dawning comprehension. "You've changed," he said, almost accusingly. "No," I replied simply. "I've always been this person. You just never bothered to see it." After he left, I called Ansel to update him on the meeting. "Curtis tried to convince me to help him counter Onyx's leadership terms," I explained. I declined. "Will he accept our terms by tomorrow's deadline?" Ansel asked. "He'll fight until the last possible moment," I replied. "But ultimately, he'll have no choice. His ego won't allow him to be the CEO who let Henderson Tech fail." The countdown to the final revelation had begun. The 24-hour deadline Onyx had given. Curtis was approaching. From my father's study, I monitored developments through my network of strategic allies at Henderson Tech. Elena Ross texted first. Curtis called emergency executive team meeting at 7 a.m., reviewing all options, looking increasingly desperate. Asked about alternative investors. Finance team confirmed none available within required time frame. Curtis would be searching frantically for any alternative to accepting Onyx's terms. His identity was so thoroughly entwined with his CEO title that surrendering it felt like an existential threat rather than a simple change of responsibilities. Ansel called mid-morning with an update from his sources on the board. 2 board members have independently contacted Onyx to express support for the leadership restructuring. They're prioritizing company survival over Curtis's ego. "Any indication of his decision?" I asked. "He's still resistant, but running out of alternatives." The CFO presented updated financial projections showing they'll miss payroll within 10 days without the Onyx investment. Curtis can't ignore that reality much longer. As noon approached, the deadline Onyx had established, "Bobby," Chen called with news from the courthouse. "Judge Johnson has reviewed the forensic accountant's analysis of Curtis's financial disclosures," he reported. "He's issued an amended ruling on the injunction. Curtis can proceed with the Onyx investment without further court approval, provided the final agreement includes independent financial management and board oversight." "That removes his last excuse," I noted. "Exactly. He can no longer claim legal obstacles to accepting Onyx's terms. The judge has essentially endorsed the very governance changes Curtis is resisting. This development would further isolate Curtis. The court, the board, the executive team, and the technical staff were all aligned in recognizing the need for new leadership, leaving him alone in his opposition. At precisely noon, Tom Peters texted from Henderson Tech headquarters. Deadline. Reached. Entire executive team in boardroom except Curtis. He's alone in his office. This wasn't surprising. When facing difficult decisions, Curtis often isolated himself. A habit I had observed throughout our marriage. He would be weighing his options, calculating which choice would best preserve his image and status. 20 minutes later, Elena texted, Curtis just entered the boardroom. Called for board vote on Onyx proposal. His expression is unreadable. The moments that followed were tense. So much planning, so many carefully calibrated moves had led to this pivotal moment. Curtis's decision would determine whether we proceeded to the final phase of our strategy or needed to adjust our approach. My phone rang. Ansel, it's done, he said simply. The board voted unanimously to accept Onyx's proposal, including the leadership restructuring. Curtis abstained but didn't oppose. He looked defeated but resigned. I felt a complex mixture of emotions, satisfaction that our strategy had succeeded, vindication that Curtis had finally been forced to recognize his limitations, but also a touch of empathy for the public humbling he was experiencing. Despite everything, I had once loved him and understood how deeply this would affect him. When will the papers be finalized? I asked. Tomorrow morning. Tom and Sarah are meeting with Henderson Tech's attorneys now to prepare the final agreement. Curtis will sign as CEO for the last time, then transition immediately to Chief Innovation Officer. And the financial transfer? Scheduled for tomorrow. Afternoon, contingent on signatures. The employees will be paid on time. That was important to me. Throughout this process, I had insisted that Henderson Tech's staff, particularly the technical team who had created its innovative technology, should not suffer for Curtis's mismanagement or my response to it. It's time for the final phase, I said. Arrange the meeting as we discussed. Ansel paused. Are you sure about the timing? We could wait until after the signatures, when everything is legally binding. No, I replied firmly. Curtis needs to understand exactly who he's dealing with before he signs, not after. He should make his final decision with full knowledge. As you wish, Ansel said. I'll set it up for this evening. After ending the call, I spent some time in quiet reflection. The carefully orchestrated strategy that had begun in the aftermath of my father's funeral was approaching its culmination. Each step had been meticulously planned, each reaction anticipated, each contingency prepared for. Yet the final revelation, the moment when Curtis would learn who was really behind Onyx, innovations, contained an element of unpredictability that strategy alone couldn't control. It would be a human moment, raw and unscripted. My father had often spoken about such moments in his courtroom. The law provides the framework, he would say, but justice happens in the human moments, when truth is recognized, when reality replaces illusion. Tonight would be such a moment. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom Peters. Final agreement drafted. Curtis asked one last modification. Public announcement to frame leadership change as his strategic decision to focus on innovation. Legal team accepting this face-saving measure as it doesn't alter substantive terms. This was perfectly consistent with Curtis's character, concerned with public perception even in defeat. I had no objection to this small concession. My objective had never been public humiliation, but recognition and transformation. Later that afternoon, Ansel confirmed the evening meeting, 7 p.m. at Whitman Venture Capital offices. Curtis told its final review with Onyx principals before tomorrow's signing. He's agreed to attend alone as requested. Everything was in place. I spent the remaining hours preparing myself mentally and emotionally for the confrontation to come. This wouldn't be about revenge or triumph. It would be about truth and recognition. I selected my outfit carefully. A tailored charcoal suit with subtle purple accents, professional yet distinctly feminine. My father's watch would complete the I-E ensemble, a reminder of his influence on my sense of justice and timing. As I dressed, Elena texted one final update. Curtis just addressed the executive team. Announced he's chosen to step aside as CEO to focus on technology innovation. Claimed it was his decision to bring in financial expertise through Onyx partnership. Team trying to maintain professional expressions, but many exchanged glances. I smiled slightly at this last attempt to control the narrative. Even now, facing the undeniable reality of his situation, Curtis was trying to frame his forced concession as a strategic choice. That illusion, like so many others, would end tonight. At 6:30 p.m., I left my father's house for the Whitman venture. Capital offices, where Curtis would finally learn the true identity of the mysterious investor who had orchestrated the transformation of his company and his position. The moment of revelation was approaching. The Whitman Venture Capital offices occupied the top floor of the city's most prestigious business tower. I arrived first, as planned, entering through the private executive elevator that bypassed the main reception area. Ansel was waiting for me in the conference room we had selected for this meeting. "Everything is prepared," he said, gesturing to the elegant room with its sweeping city views. "Tom and Sarah are in the adjacent office, ready to join after the initial conversation." I nodded, taking a seat at the head of the conference table, a position carefully chosen for its psychological impact. "And Curtis?" "On his way up. Reception just called." Ansel studied me with concern. "Are you certain about this approach? We could still have Tom deliver the news, with you joining afterward." "No," I replied firmly. "This needs to be direct. From me to him, no intermediaries." Ansel nodded, understanding. "I'll be next door with the team if you need anything." As he left, I placed my father's legal notepad before me, alongside the bound investment agreement that Curtis expected to review tonight and sign tomorrow. Everything was in place. Minutes later, I heard the elevator chime, followed by muffled voices in the reception area. Then the conference room door opened, and Curtis stepped inside, his expression shifting from professional composure to utter shock as he registered my presence. He froze in the doorway, confusion evident on his face. "Ayami? What are you... Where are the Onyx representatives?" I met his gaze directly. "They'll join us shortly. Please sit down." Curtis remained standing, his confusion transforming rapidly to suspicion. "If this is some attempt to interfere with the investment..." "It's not interference," I interrupted calmly. "It's clarification. The investment will proceed as agreed. The terms remain unchanged. There's simply one detail you should understand. Before signing..." His eyes narrowed. "What detail?" "Who you're really making a deal with." I gestured to the chair across from me. "Please, sit." Reluctantly, Curtis took the seat, his body language tense, defensive. "Curtis," I began, my voice steady, "Onyx Innovations is a shell company created specifically to invest in Henderson Tech Solutions. It has one principal investor who will control the board seats and appoint the new CEO." He leaned forward, irritation visible. "I'm aware of the structure. What's your point?" "My point is the identity of that principal investor." I paused, holding his gaze. "It's me." The silence that followed was absolute. Curtis stared at me, his expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and dawning comprehension. That's not possible," he finally managed. "I assure you it is." I slid a document across the table, the ownership structure of Onyx. Innovations with my name clearly listed as principal. Onyx was created through Whitman Venture Capital at my direction, funded with my inheritance from my father, and designed specifically to restructure Henderson Tech's leadership. Curtis's face drained of color as the implications sank in. You engineered all of this? The investment proposal? The leadership restructuring? The board changes?" "Yes." "Why?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Because you sent me divorce papers during my father's funeral, dismissing my contribution to building Henderson Tech, undervaluing our marital assets, and assuming I would be too devastated to respond effectively, I kept my tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. You miscalculated. Curtis sat back heavily in his chair, the full reality of the situation finally hitting him. So, this was all about revenge. No, I corrected. It was about recognition and transformation. The company needed proper financial management and accountability. The technical team deserved leadership that valued their contributions. The board needed independent voices. I paused. And you needed to understand exactly who you were dismissing when you sent those divorce papers. His expression shifted as he processed this information, anger giving way to something more complex. The judge's ruling, the forensic accountant, Elena and the technical team, were they all part of your plan? The plan leveraged existing realities, I explained. The financial mismanagement was real. The technical team's frustration was real. Judge Johnson's concerns about your disclosures were based on actual evidence. I simply created circumstances where those realities became impossible to ignore or conceal. Curtis stared at the agreement before him, then back at me, his face showing the first traces of something I hadn't seen from him in years. Genuine respect. You outmaneuvered me, he said quietly. Completely. The door opened, and Tom and Sarah entered, followed by Ansel. Curtis looked at them with new understanding, finally seeing the coordinated strategy that had brought him to this moment. The terms remain as agreed, I said as the others took their seats. Henderson Tech will receive the investment it needs. The employees will keep their jobs. The technology will continue to develop. You will transition to Chief Innovation Officer, focusing on what you do best. Curtis studied me for a long moment. And if I refuse to sign now that I know who's really behind this? Then Henderson Tech fails, I replied simply. And we both lose. Is that really what you want? His answer would determine everything that followed. Curtis stared at the investment agreement before him, the silence in the room heavy with significance. I could almost see the calculations running behind his eyes, weighing his pride against the company's survival, his ego against the reality of his situation. You've thought of everything, he finally said, his voice holding a strange mix of bitterness and grudging admiration. Not everything, I replied honestly. Just the most probable scenarios based on knowing how you think and operate. He looked up sharply. And how is that? You prioritize appearance over substance. You value control over collaboration. You take credit for others' work, particularly women's contributions. I kept my tone analytical rather than accusatory. But you also genuinely care about the technology Henderson Tech has developed. You believe in its potential, even if your management style has undermined it. Curtis's expression tightened, then gradually relaxed as he recognized the accuracy of my assessment. What happens if I sign? He asked. Beyond the terms in this agreement, what happens between us? It was a fair question, perhaps the first truly honest one he had asked throughout this process. The divorce proceeds, but with a fair valuation of assets and appropriate recognition of my contribution to building Henderson Tech. We both move forward, you as CIO with the freedom to focus on innovation rather than financial management, me as board chair guiding the company's strategic direction. And we work together? He sounded skeptical. Professionally, yes, with clear boundaries and defined roles. I leaned forward slightly. Curtis, this isn't about punishing you. It's about creating the right structure for Henderson Tech to succeed and for both of us to contribute what we do best. He considered this, then asked the question that truly concerned him. How will this be perceived publicly? Even now, facing this extraordinary situation, Curtis's mind went first to appearances. But rather than dismissing his concern, I addressed it directly. The public announcement will frame this as a strategic restructuring to position Henderson Tech for growth. Your transition to CIO will be presented as a decision to focus on your strengths in technology innovation. No one outside this room needs to know the full circumstances. Relief flickered across his face. I had understood what mattered to him and offered a solution that protected his public image while achieving the substantive changes required. Tom slid a pen across the table. The employees are counting on this investment, Mr. Henderson. 50 jobs and a promising technology hang in the balance. Curtis picked up the pen, hesitated for one final moment, then signed the agreement. As he set the pen down, the tension visibly drained from his shoulders. When will the announcement be made? He asked. Tomorrow afternoon, Ansel replied, after the funds transfer is complete and payroll is secured. Curtis nodded, then looked directly at me. You could have destroyed everything. Why didn't you? Because Henderson Tech isn't just your creation. It's the work of dozens of talented people whose contributions deserve to be preserved and valued. And because destruction is easy, transformation is more challenging and more worthwhile. For perhaps the first time in our relationship, Curtis truly saw me, not as an accessory to his success, not as a supporting character in his narrative, but as a strategic equal with vision and capabilities that matched or exceeded his own. I underestimated you, he said, echoing words he had spoken before but now with genuine recognition rather than defensive accusation. Completely and consistently. Yes, I agreed simply. You did. As the meeting concluded and the others filed out, Curtis lingered. There's one thing I still don't understand. How did you put all this together so quickly? The divorce papers arrived less than 3 weeks ago. I smiled slightly. Curtis, I've been a lawyer watching you build a technology company for 8 years. I've observed every meeting, reviewed every contract, noted every strategic decision, many of which incorporated my suggestions without acknowledgement. I didn't need to create a strategy from scratch. I simply needed to apply what I already knew. He absorbed this. Recognition dawning of how thoroughly he had dismissed my capabilities while simultaneously benefiting from them. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I'm sorry about sending those papers during the funeral. It was cruel. Yes, it was, I acknowledged. But it was also the catalyst that freed me to use everything I had learned and everything I am capable of. In an odd way, I should thank you for that moment of clarity. As Curtis left, Ansel returned to the conference room. So he signed, he observed. Did it go as you expected? Better, in some ways, I replied. I think he finally sees me clearly. And that matters to you? I considered the question. Not for emotional validation, but for him to understand the full scope of his miscalculation. That does matter. It's not about revenge. It's about recognition. The next day unfolded exactly as planned. The funds were transferred to Henderson Tech's accounts. The payroll was processed on schedule. The carefully worded press release announced the company's strategic restructuring and new investment partnership. Curtis began his transition to Chief Innovation Officer while the search committee, which I would chair, began identifying candidates for the CEO position. Eleanor Ross was promoted to Chief Technology Officer, her contributions finally receiving appropriate recognition. As I sat in my first official board meeting as chairperson, I felt not triumph, but satisfaction. This wasn't about winning or losing, about punishment or revenge. It was about transformation, of a company, of a relationship, and of my own life. My father would have understood. His judicial philosophy had always emphasized restoration over retribution. The best outcome, he often said, isn't when someone loses, but when everyone's position improves through recognition of truth. Through this crucible of conflict and strategy, a new truth had emerged, not just about Curtis's limitations or my capabilities, but about the power of strategic patience and clear-eyed assessment. The woman who had received divorce papers at her father's funeral had transformed into someone new, yet also someone who had been there all along, waiting for recognition. 6 months have passed since that pivotal meeting, where Curtis finally understood who he had been dealing with all along. Henderson Tech has transformed under new leadership, with our technology finally receiving the recognition and market adoption it deserves. Curtis has found his place as Chief Innovation Officer, focusing on what he truly does best without the pressures of financial management. The divorce was finalized 3 months ago, with a fair settlement that recognized my contribution to building the company. But the true value wasn't in the financial terms, it was in the recognition, the acknowledgement of worth that had been denied for so long. I'm often asked if I planned all of this from the moment I received those divorce papers at my father's funeral. The truth is both simpler and more complex. I didn't have a detailed blueprint, but I had something more powerful: clarity. In that moment of profound grief and shock, I saw with perfect clarity who Curtis was, who I was, and what needed to change. Want to speak directly to you? Yes, you? The woman who has been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed. The woman whose contributions have been minimized, or whose capabilities have been questioned. I see you, and I have something important to tell you. Your power doesn't come from other people's recognition. It exists within you, whether acknowledged or not. The skills you've developed while supporting others, the insights you've gained while being overlooked, the strategies you've learned while navigating difficult relationships, these are not lesser abilities. They are profound strengths waiting to be deployed. When someone underestimates you, they're not defining your limits. They're revealing their own perception gaps. Those gaps aren't your burden to bear. They're their vulnerability waiting to be exposed. To the woman whose ideas are appropriated in meetings, document everything. Build allies who will attribute credit properly. Your insights are valuable. Ensure they're recognized as yours. To the woman who's been told she's just a wife, just a mother, just an assistant, there is no just about the work you do or the capabilities you possess. Those roles require emotional intelligence, strategic thinking, and execution skills that transfer powerfully to any context. To the woman whose expertise is questioned despite her qualifications, your knowledge doesn't require external validation. To be legitimate. Stand firm in what you know. To the woman trapped in financial control. Start small. Document everything. Build knowledge and resources incrementally. There is always a path to independence, even when it's not immediately visible. My father taught me that timing is everything. Not just when to act, but when to wait. When to speak and when to observe. Strategic patience isn't passivity. It's power gathering. It's studying the landscape, identifying leverage points, and preparing for the perfect moment to transform your situation. What happened with Curtis wasn't about revenge. Revenge keeps you tethered to past wounds, focused backward instead of forward. This was about transformation, creating something new from the ruins of what was broken. The most powerful response to being underestimated isn't anger, though that emotion has its place. It's not vindictiveness, though the desire for vindication is natural. The most powerful response is strategic clarity, seeing the reality without illusion, including your own capabilities and others' limitations. When my husband texted divorce papers while I was at my father's funeral, he thought he was catching me at my most vulnerable. What he didn't understand was that he was witnessing my most powerful moment. The moment when all illusions fell away, and I saw with perfect clarity what needed to be done. Your moment of clarity may come differently. It might arrive quietly, after years of subtle dismissal. It might crash in dramatically through betrayal or crisis. However it arrives, recognize it, honor it, and then use it as the foundation for your transformation. You have capabilities that someone has dismissed. You have power that someone has attempted to diminish. You have value that transcends the narrow roles others might try to confine you to. The face of someone who has underestimated you when they finally recognize their miscalculation? That's not the prize. It's just confirmation of what you already knew, that you were always more than their limited perception allowed them to see. The real victory isn't in their recognition. It's in your self-recognition. It's in building something new that honors your true capabilities. It's in transforming not just your circumstances, but your understanding of what you can achieve. To every woman who has ever been underestimated, I see you. I recognize your capacity for strategic thinking, for patience, for transformation. Your moment of clarity is coming, or perhaps it's already here. When it arrives, remember this. You don't need to break what doesn't serve you. You can transform it into something that does. And in that transformation, you will find not just revenge, not just vindication, but something far more powerful. Your true potential unleashed. That is the greatest empowerment of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.